Well, welcome everyone. This is part of a series of special events that we run every 3 months or so, or when I remember, every time we have a very special guest. This time we're going to talk about, as you said in the chat, the magic of metaphors, how metaphors and analogies can make your communication more impactful. And before we get started, for those of you who don't know me, just a super quick intro from my side. My name is Andrea. I'm the head of a company called Ideas on Stage UK. I'm a presentation coach. We specialize in working with business owners, leaders, and their teams who want to become more confident presenters. In the last 14 years, we've worked with thousands of clients around the world, including business leaders from organizations like Spotify, eBay, Salesforce, Amazon, and more than 500 TEDx speakers. Our mission is to stop great ideas from failing just because of the way they are presented. And our vision is to help hundreds of thousands of business leaders inspire their audiences, increase their influence, and make a positive impact in the world. And that's it. Now, just a couple of house rules here on Zoom. I see many of you with the webcam on, not everyone. So, of course, up to you. But if you want to have a good experience today, then if you want to turn your webcam on, that's the best thing we can do to have a good connection with each other. And also, feel free to use the chat. Let's make it as interactive as possible. I would love for this session to be as dynamic, as interactive as possible. Use the chat, share your ideas, share your comments. By the way, share your questions as well. After the presentation, I'm going to pick your questions from the chat, and then I'm going to ask our guest speaker directly. So if you have any questions, make sure that you type them in the chat. Our speaker is going to talk for about half an hour, more or less, and then we'll have a bit of a Q&A, and we're going to close the event. Very simple. And I also want to thank our partners. We've got some amazing organizations who keep supporting us for these events. You will find the links in the chat. We have organizations like Startups Magazine, Impact Hub London, Everyday People, Hatch, Alia, and we've got Emma. Emma, we met at one of our previous events when you were supporting us. And the one thing in common is that all these organizations believe in business as a force for good, and that's what they share with us at Ideas on Stage. We are big advocates for business as a force for good. Again, you've got the links in the chart. Check them out. Great organizations. By the way, stay tuned, because at the end I'll give you a link where you can get access to lots of free resources, promotions, discount from these organizations. And our speaker today is the CEO of executive coaching firm Big Blue Gamble. He's an award-winning adjunct professor of leadership at NYU. I understand that we've got some students as well here, and Columbia as well. He's a TEDx speaker and the author of Visual Leadership. Check it out, the book. It's just one word, Visual Leadership, leveraging the power of visual thinking in leadership and in life. And there's one chapter in that book where he talks about the power of metaphors in leadership, in communication. We've collaborated a number of times in the past. I think that he's the best in the world at using metaphors and analogies when communicating his ideas. I'm sure that you're going to learn a lot today. So please welcome, let's give him a big round of applause, Todd Cherches. Todd, thank you very much for your time. Great to see you.
Andrea, great to see you. Always great collaborating with you. I'm going to let me get my screen up. Video up on the screen right here. Oops, sorry. Let me get full screen. There we go. All right. All right, so thank you for having me. It's great to see so many familiar faces and new friends as well. Feel free to link in with me. I love continuing the conversation online after the workshop. So the magic of metaphors, what makes them so magical? Hopefully that's what we'll be talking about today, and you'll leave here with a new sense of what metaphor is all about, and then how you could use metaphors to be more effective and more strategic. So I'd like to share with you 3 quick stories to open up. And as you notice, I'm from New York and I talk really fast, so you'll probably get about 2 hours worth of content in less than 30 minutes. So, hopefully that'll be okay. So 3 quick stories. Story number one of my coaching clients had a retention issue. And when I did a 360 with his people, turned out they were really terrified of him. So when he would say things like, I need to see you in my office, people would go into a state of panic and fear. And then he was wondering why people weren't performing and why people were leaving, and why people were so intimidated just when he was around. So I said to him, if you were to describe yourself in terms of the weather, would you say that you are a cloud of doom and gloom or a ray of sunshine who lights up a room? Right? So instead of saying you need to be less grumpy and less mean, I just used this metaphor. And he said, yeah, I'm kind of like the cloud with the thunder and lightning that's all in the storms that's just about to happen. So what I said to him was, that's up to you, right? What is your leadership weather report? When you walk into a room, think about the fact that the weather outside is beyond your control, but the climate you create inside your organization is entirely up to you. That changed his way of looking at how he came across, and he tried to be that ray of sunshine. It didn't happen overnight, but over time, but this metaphor resonated with him. That's story number one, your leadership weather report. Story number two, I was brought into a company, a Wall Street company, to do a leadership program a number of years ago. And just before I was about to start, the company announced that they were being acquired by another company. So here we are in New York, and this company was bought by a company in Kansas City, and everyone went into a panic. So imagine how distracting that was to try to start a leadership program with everyone talking about this new acquisition and, should I go back to my desk and start packing up my boxes? I really had trouble wrangling them in and getting them to focus on the training. So the people who brought me in said you need to get them back on track, but don't mention the acquisition. But I said, you know what? How are we supposed to do that? There's this gigantic elephant in the room that no one wants to talk about, and I keep this little elephant in my room just to remind me to not avoid the big picture. So what we did is we started talking about the impact of this acquisition, and it turned out, and we came to agreement that whether you were staying or going, the skills you were going to develop in this training are going to help you. That's my elephant in the room story, which is number two. Story number three, I used to travel a lot on business, and I used to spend hours trying to match my socks to my tie, to my suit, to my shirt. And I realized how much time I was wasting. So I went to Macy's and I just bought 18 pairs of black socks. And you know what? No one noticed and no one cared, right? So think about that. I call this black sock decision making. What are some of the decisions you have to make in your work and in your life that if you just simplified it and got rid of all the complexity, it would help you and free your mind up and your time up to make decisions and focus on the things that really matter. So those were 3 quick stories. And if you think about these stories and what they have in common, one thing they have in common is that they're all chapters in my book, which Andrea kindly mentioned, my book, Visual Leadership. But secondly, what all 3 of these stories have in common is they all use metaphors to address real world business issues. So a lot of times we think of metaphors as being, part of poetry and songwriting, and think about most blog posts, most book titles, many movie titles are metaphorical, right? They're not literal, but they're metaphorical. So how can we use metaphors in a business context to be more effective? That's what we want to talk about today. And by the way, how many examples did I just use? My visual is kind of giving it away, or it's completely giving it away. It's 3. So the rule of 3 in presenting, as Andrea knows as well as anyone in his terrific book, a little plug for Andrea and his excellent book, The Confident Presenter. The rule of 3 is magical. So that's one. Sometimes we overload people with metaphors and examples and stories, but the rule of 3, scientifically proven, is what works for people. So that's just one tip, and no additional charge, is to think about the rule of 3 whenever you're presenting. So let's get to the subject at hand, which is what is metaphor? And you'll see examples throughout my presentation of stories, of visual imagery, of visual language. Metaphor, very simply, is a figure of speech by which a characteristic of one object is assigned to another. A lot of people think I was a business major because I teach management and leadership, I do team building, everything I do is business related, but I was actually an English literature major with a concentration in Shakespeare and poetry. I remember my father saying to me when I told him I was majoring in English literature, he's like, what are you going to do, sit under a tree reading Shakespeare for the rest of your life? How are you going to make a living? But as it turns out, metaphor and storytelling and some of the aspects of literature and the entertainment industry, which I used to work in, are relevant to the world of business. So how can we use metaphors to be more effective? And I love, as an English major, I love word origins, and I'm on etymology.com all the time looking up word origins. Meta means over or across, and feron, the second half, means to carry or to bear. So a metaphor is a word used in a strange sense, is how they describe it, to apply one thing to describe another for the purpose of, well, I'll tell you about what the purpose is in just a few minutes. Let that linger out there for a minute. But this was interesting. They show this graph of how the use of the word metaphor has skyrocketed in recent years. So again, metaphors are not just for poets and songwriters, they're for all of us. And if you start to become more attuned and more aware to metaphor, you'll realize how often you use them and other people use them in everyday language. In fact, the cultural anthropologist Mary Catherine Bateson once said that the human species thinks in metaphors and learns through stories. I love this. This is one of my favorite quotes. So I'll read that again. The human species, which is all of us, right? We think in metaphors and we learn through stories. So why is that? It's just the way our brains are wired. But let's take a little deeper dive into why metaphors. So as I talk about in my TED Talk on the power of visual thinking, whether you're talking about using visual imagery, visual language, visual storytelling, or metaphors, there's three components that factor in: A, C, and R: attention, comprehension, and retention. When you use metaphors, whether it's pictures or visual language, metaphorical language, it captures people's attention and it gets them to focus because it's unusual, it's mysterious. People are waiting to see and make that cognitive connection. So metaphors help us to gain people's attention and focus. Secondly, it enhances comprehension because people will understand something. If you explain a complex topic, if you could simplify it and explain it in terms of something someone already knows, it will make that connection and help them to understand what you're talking about. And also metaphors, because they're visual, aids in retention, so people are more likely to remember. So just remember these three words: attention, comprehension, and retention. Whenever you're using visual imagery, visual language, storytelling, and metaphor, it accomplishes all three of these objectives. So our learning objectives for today are: one, we're talking about the what and the why of metaphors. Two, we're going to talk about how using metaphors will enhance your creative thinking and your communication and your presentation skills. And throughout, we want to incorporate real-world business applications to say, how can I use this? I always say that the true value of knowledge is not in its accumulation, but in its application. So be thinking as we're talking, how can I use some of these techniques in my business, in my work at school, or in everyday life? So one thing I want to mention, though, when we're talking about metaphors, there's a lot of different figures of speech. There are similes, there are analogies, there are idioms. So I don't want to spend, in my longer workshops, we get into the details and the differences of all of these. But for today, let's just talk about, we're going to refer to everything as metaphors just to bucket everything together when you use one thing to describe something else. And again, we'll weave those in throughout. But for the purpose of today, we want to focus on metaphors. So with this in mind, I'd like to know if you could, in the chat box, what are some of your favorite metaphors? What are some of the metaphors that you use in, and I see Patty raised the question, what's the difference between the metaphor and the analogy? I'm just going to answer that real quick, because a lot of times, again, we're getting into semantics, but a metaphor says something is something else. Analogy says something is like something else. So if you say, my love is like a red, red rose that's newly sprung in June, that's an analogy, because you're saying my love is like a rose. And then you talk about how that is. If you say leadership is a journey, that's a metaphor. So it's a very subtle distinction, but thank you for asking that, Patty. So I can't read through all the comments because they're coming in too quickly. But yeah, share your, let's take a few seconds just to see what metaphors you like to use. I see journey and pathways, sailing. What are some others that you like to use either in your business or in everyday life? Keep them coming. These are great. Presentation is like a first date. Love it. Car. Herding cats. Love it, Emma. What are some others that you like to use? All right, these are great starts. So I'm going to talk about visuals, dance partner, improvisation. Love it. The journey. All right, so these are some of the ones that you like to use. I'm going to give you some of my favorites today. So for example, one of my favorites is, and I mentioned I was an English literature major. In Hamlet, Hamlet says to Horatio, I think methinks I see my father. And Horatio says, where, my lord? And Hamlet says, in my mind's eye, Horatio. So think about that term, to see something in your mind's eye. We don't literally have an eye in our mind. It's a metaphor, right? It says that we have a picture in our head, right? So we have a picture in the head. We can see something not through our physical eye, but through our metaphorical mental eye. So if you think about this image that we're seeing, the word image is the root of the word imagination, right? So this is all tied together. This is all about seeing. And one of my phrases I always use is that if you can see the invisible, you can do the impossible. So our challenge is, how do we get ideas out of our heads and into the heads of other people so that we could be more effective? So for example, you have an idea, it pops into your head. We need to think about, how can I frame that idea so I could get that idea out of my head and into the head of someone else, with the goal being getting them to think and to say, I see what you're saying. If you think about it, that's the focus of every communication, whether it's an email or TED Talk, a podcast, a webinar like this, or a speech in front of 1 million people. We're trying to get people to see what we're saying. So when we talk about having a leadership vision, a leader has a picture in their head of a future state that's different from and better than the current reality, but you can't motivate and inspire other people to make that vision a reality unless you can get that idea out of your head and out there into the world. Bernard Baruch said the ability to express an idea is as important as the idea itself. So that's what the power of presentation, the power of metaphor, that's why it is so crucial. So let's talk about some examples, some real world examples. If someone says, what is visual thinking? And I say, well, in a nutshell, which is an idiom, in a nutshell, visual thinking is about thinking in pictures as opposed to words and numbers. It is not literally in a nutshell. It means in a small, concise way. That's a very common metaphor that we use. I mentioned framing an idea as if putting a picture frame around something. My wife once bought a painting at Home Goods, and I was like, it's okay, I don't love it. But then she changed the frame, and I really liked it. So sometimes, think about that. Sometimes you can have an idea or something that you don't love, but if you reframe it, you can improve it. You could change the way it's presented. So framing an idea is a metaphor, but also one thing that we often overlook just because it's so obvious that it almost becomes a cliche that we don't even notice it anymore, is the light bulb, right? A light bulb to represent an idea is a metaphor, right? A light bulb literally has nothing specifically to do with an idea, but yet when we see a light bulb above someone's head, we know it represents a flash of inspiration or an idea. So here's a little trivia. When and where did the idea of using a light bulb to visually represent an idea originate? So in the chat box, who can guess where was the first time that was used as a metaphor? I'll give you a hint. It was about 100 years ago. Any guesses? Cartoons, yes. Nick Brand said cartoons. Any idea which cartoon? Radio, good guess. So in Felix the Cat in the 1920s, whenever he was thinking something, the animator would draw that thing over his head. Edison had invented, quote unquote, invented the light bulb not long before that. That became a metaphor. And if you look at the light bulb with the filament and the glow around it, we're using that same metaphorical image 100 years later. Again, that's the power of a good metaphor. It could still be used 100 years later. So why metaphors and analogies? They make the abstract concrete. They make intangible things tangible. They help to simplify complexity. They make the unfamiliar familiar and the invisible visible. And the last one is my favorite because I tend to focus on visual thinking. But these are all the reasons to use metaphors and analogies in our everyday life and in our speech. So let's talk about some real examples. But first, this is a classic quote by Aristotle. So even a couple thousand years ago, Aristotle wrote, "The greatest thing by far is to be a master of metaphor. It is the one thing that cannot be learned from others, and is also a sign of genius, since a good metaphor implies an intuitive perception of the similarity in the dissimilar." And I love this quote. So hopefully when you all leave here today, you will all be masters of metaphor. So here's a few examples just to bring this to life. So we often talk about the key to success. Hate to break it to you, there is no real key, right? It's a metaphor. So that implies that there's a door or some obstacle standing in the way, and whatever this thing is, like for example, being better at presenting is one of the keys to success because it'll help you get your ideas out there. So a key, just as a key opens a door, being better at using metaphors will help you to open the doors to success. So that's a metaphor. In the HR field, we often talk about having a career path as if it's a walk in the park laid out for you. For me, my career has been a roller coaster. That's my metaphor. Ups and downs, twists and turns, exhilarating highs, and terrifying plummets. So whether your career has been a path or a roller coaster, that's a metaphor. And sometimes when we're on a path, we'll come to a fork in the road. Again, another metaphor. And as I see Steve Gardner smiling, as Yogi Berra said, if when you come to a fork in the road, take it, right? So when you see the visual, you see how complicated that decision could be. And this also reminds me, being an English major, of Robert Frost's poem, The Road Not Taken, right? Two roads diverged in the yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both and be one traveler, right? Long I stood and looked down one as long as I could. And then he had to make a decision which path to take. So there you go. That's the answer to my father, why my poetry major came in handy, even today, 30 years later. This is a common metaphor. I mentioned this in my TED Talk, and I talk about this in my NYU and Columbia classes all the time. We talk about how a leadership is a journey, how the windshield represents the future, the rearview mirror represents the past, and our dashboard represents how do we measure success. That's a metaphor. We often talk about leadership as like walking a tightrope without a net, right? We could talk about how is this the case. So again, just as with the leadership weather report, how that turned around my executive coaching client to change his attitude and his behaviors, a metaphor like leadership is like walking a tightrope without a net, that triggers a lot of conversations around fear, around, what can you do to successfully get from point A to point B. Another common metaphor I use is the conversation around how management is like checkers while leadership is more like chess. So just think about that for a second. What's similar? They're both played on the same type of board, and yet what's different, right? When you in order to explain this analogy, you need to understand the distinctions between management and leadership. So again, it forces us to think differently, to look at things through a new lens. This is what, speaking of new lenses, one of my favorites is management is about looking through a microscope while leadership is like looking through a telescope. Management is about details, looking down and deep, right? It's about execution. It's about being task focused. Leadership is about looking out there into the stars and seeing what's possible. So just again, this one metaphor, and sometimes I talk about looking through a kaleidoscope, right? In terms of innovation, how using all the colors of the kaleidoscope and the colors of the rainbow can change the way we see something. So again, it's a lens through which we see the world. And chapter 29 of my book takes a deeper dive into all these different metaphors and analogies to understand management and leadership. One of the hot topics in today's workplace is burnout, right? If you say I'm really burnt out, that's just a word. But if you think about the fact that you're like a candle with a flickering flame that's going to go out any minute unless you find a way to rejuvenate yourself, that changes the way you think about burnout. How can we keep this flame alive? Brings the abstract, intangible concept of burnout to life. If we say that feedback is a gift, in what way is giving someone feedback like giving them a present, right? And when someone gives you a gift, we need to say thank you. So in the same way, how is feedback a gift? Sometimes we say someone is like talking to a wall or sounding like a broken record. I once used the metaphor sounding like a broken record in my NYU class without this visual, and one of my students thought it was a good thing, like breaking a record in the Olympics, because she had never listened to a vinyl album and known the pleasure of having the needle stick in one of the grooves. So when you use metaphors, think about your audience. We're going to talk more about that in a few minutes. Your metaphor can either clarify or confuse depending on who you're talking to. So we're going to talk more about that shortly. One of my favorite metaphors is how visual coaching is a new frontier, the use of visuals in our coaching practice. I presented on this at Columbia University a couple of years ago. And if you think about coaching in our language, what's the parallel between a stage coach and coaching, as we do when we're coaching other people in leadership or presentation skills coaching? Word origins. This English word that we commonly use came from this French word, which came from this German word, which came from this Hungarian word, which came from this Scythian Hungary, Coach Hungary, with a stage located right here on your map, in case you don't know where that is, which is where the stagecoach was invented years ago. So if you think about coaching as getting people, wait, let me go back for 1 second, special effects, high-tech special effects there. When we're trying to get people from where they are to where they could be, that's what coaching is all about, right? Our job as coaches is to help people get from where they are to where they could be. And so we are a vehicle of transport. Coaching is a metaphor, and I read about that in chapter 32. We don't even think about the ways in which we're helping someone get from point A to point B as if we are a driver of a coach. I was driving down, I was actually in an Uber, I wasn't driving, when I took this picture of the Brooklyn Bridge, and the phrase, "we'll cross that bridge when we come to it," popped into my head. So a lot of times we will see a visual image and it will remind us of a concept, an idea, a saying, right? Now, for me, the Brooklyn Bridge is my bridge, but in 3 weeks, I'll be doing a workshop in San Francisco. They have a different bridge. So if I say we'll cross that bridge when we come to it, the Brooklyn Bridge pops into my head, but someone in San Francisco, the Golden Gate Bridge might pop into their head. Or if you're in London, not the London Bridge, but the Tower Bridge, right? Andreas, are you smiling? Right? So when I say the word bridge, we all know what a bridge is, yet but a visual image of that bridge will pop into different heads depending on what your orientation is. So one of the key takeaways again is to think about our audience. What will resonate with them? What's the image that you are creating in their mind's eye? That's a big part of what we're talking about today. So whether you're using a bridge literally or metaphorically, it's about connection. It's about getting from one end of something to another. And one of my college textbooks, and I didn't realize or appreciate this at the time, was called Bridges, Not Walls. And if you look at this stone bridge, right, a bridge, communication can connect us as a bridge does or divide us as a wall does, right? So the goal of communication, the goal of presentation, the goal of using metaphors is to help connect ideas and connect people one to another, right? So one of the things to think about is how do you customize your metaphor to your audience? So that's one of the key things to think about. We need to know our audience, and Andrea talks about a lot about that all the time, as does Gar Reynolds and Dan Rome, right? We need to customize our communication to our audience. So while I'm a big Yankees fan, they lost last night, Steve Gardner, tough game. I'm a Yankees fan. I also root for the Mets as well, coming from Queens, New York. My mother was from the Bronx. My father was from Brooklyn. So we have both the New York teams in our vocabulary. That's my metaphor. I'm obsessed with baseball. I use baseball analogies all the time. But if I'm talking to someone from another country or another culture where baseball doesn't resonate, I may want to choose another metaphor. So when I was doing a workshop in Canada, hockey is the first thing that comes to mind. Not that they don't know or play baseball in Canada, but if you want to connect with your audience, talk about something that they have a passion for, that they have an interest in, which happen to be hockey. So if I'm talking about people in Europe, I'll talk about soccer, although I'll make sure to call it football, right? So they don't think I'm an American who doesn't know what he's talking about. If I'm talking to someone in India, I might use cricket as a metaphor. Or if someone in New Zealand or Australia, I might use rugby. So it's important, again, to modify your metaphors, your stories, your examples, your analogies to the audience, to the culture that you're speaking to. And if you notice, there's diversity in your slides, in your images, in your stories, in your metaphors. There's no one-size-fits-all solution. So you want to remember that representation matters. Whenever you're presenting, you want to think about, all right, who's my audience and what's going to connect me with them? Because if you use metaphors that resonate with people, not only do they get what you're saying, but they will think about you, oh, you get me, right? You understand me, right? So Stephen Covey in the 7 Habits, habit number 5 is seek first to understand and then to be understood. So if you understand your audience, you can modify your metaphors, again, not in a manipulative way, but in a genuine, sincere way, in such a way that you will connect with them and they will connect with you. So a metaphor like tennis is more universal than some of the other sports I just mentioned, or nature, right? If I say tree, everyone here may picture a different tree depending on where you live or what trees you like or have growing in your yard. But if I say we need to plant the seed of a new idea, get to the root of a problem, we need to go out on a limb, we need to branch out in new directions, we need to see which ideas bear fruit, and if we are successful, the sky's the limit. I just used 6 different metaphors relating to nature or trees, and everyone could get it regardless of what tree you're picturing in your mind's eye. So that's a key message too, is think about the local, but also you want to think about the universal. How is my message going to resonate with a diverse audience of different cultures and different countries? In the chat box, let's see who could be the first person to fill in the blank. Life is like what? A box of chocolates. All right, see the chocolates. Teresa Fortunato, one of my other former NYU students, chime in. Life is like a box of chocolates. Sometimes when I show this slide to my NYU students, I get blank stares. They have no idea. If I'm teaching a 25-year-old female from Beijing who has never seen Forrest Gump, who doesn't know who Tom Hanks is and has never heard this expression, they will put in anything else but a box of chocolates. So that just reminds us that the metaphors that are so obvious to us may not be obvious to someone else or familiar to someone else based on all of these factors of culture and gender and age and everything else, right? So life is like a box of chocolates is a classic metaphor that we all, or analogy that we all grew up with. How is it like a box of chocolates? Because you never know what you're going to get, as Tim Richards put into the chat box, right? We don't know what we're going to get because until we take a bite out of that chocolate, we don't know what's inside, except there's an exception to this. And that is the Whitman sampler. What is in the chat box? What does the Whitman sampler do that no other box of chocolates do? Tim just put it in. It has a map. In fact, I just happen to have a box of Whitman's chocolates on me. Unfortunately, there's no chocolates left because I finished them. But if you can see on the inside, there is indeed a map which shows you what each of the chocolates is. So had I had that growing up, it would have resolved a lot of fights with my brother who used to take a bite out of them and put them back in after not, he was looking for the cherry and he ended up with the molasses or something, right? So when you have a map, it communicates to us what's inside. It makes the invisible visible, right? So think about that. How could you use mind mapping? How could you use a diagram? How could you use, again, visual imagery to communicate to other people what they're not seeing? So metaphors help us to make the invisible visible. And again, I finished an entire box of chocolates while taking these pictures, which is why so many of them are missing. So I have tons of other examples. This was just the what? In the chat box, who could go first? What metaphor am I representing here? The tip of the iceberg. Thank you, Dieter and others. So when you use the analogy, something is just the tip of the iceberg, it represents what we know or what we see versus what we don't. And this reminds us that there is so much more that we don't see than that we do. So a workshop like this is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to visual thinking and metaphors. It's up to you to dive beneath the surface if you want to expand your knowledge and your skills in using metaphors more effectively. So before we get to the Q&A, I want to leave you with one final story. I wrote an Inc. article called "Can You Draw What Your Company Does?" And if you Google that title, you can find that article. Just go to Inc. Can You Draw What Your Company Does? And you'll find it. So this was the story. This is an exercise I do with my clients. I had everyone, this was a sales team for a pharmaceutical company. I had everyone get up with a flip chart and they had to draw a metaphor or some image that represents the company, what they did, and how they were different from and better than the competition. So one person drew a whale eating up the goldfish competitor, saying, we're the biggest and the best, and we're going to eat up the competition, who are little goldfish. I loved it. I thought, oh, this was great. But the VP of sales said, I love the drawing. Not that great a drawing, but that doesn't matter. We get the idea. It's not, when we use visual imagery and drawing, it's not about our drawing skills. It's about our ability to think visually and convey things visually, which he did a great job of. Unfortunately, the VP said, this is not accurate. So while it's a good metaphor, it's wrong. So this is not helping us. So we said, well, what would be a better metaphor? He said, well, let's stay underwater, right? Instead of having a whale eating goldfish, which does not reflect us because some of our competitors are bigger than us, it's more like our competitors are, and he thought about it a little bit, it's more like our competitors are a great white shark. They're vicious, they're cutthroat, they're ruthless, they're sales driven. They just want to bite off your business and swim away, leaving you bleeding. We are like, what would you guess that he said? You're going to keep underwater here. what metaphor would you use? A goldfish, a boat, keep going. It's in the fish/mammal category to a whale. Nope. A dolphin. Rachel Rodriguez just got it. So he said, we're more like a dolphin. We are friendly. We are cuddly. We are caring. We are communicative. We will not bite off your limb and leave you bleeding. We will stay with you. We'll support you. We'll be there to help you. So just by changing that metaphor from whale versus goldfish to shark versus dolphin, we came up with the saying, we may not be the biggest or the baddest, but we are the best. So the dolphin became their metaphor and their mascot. The dolphin became the way they were going to treat customers and interact with customers. They were going to communicate. We were going to be friendly. We're going to be warm. We're going to be cuddly, right? That's how we're going to differentiate ourselves and beat the competition. So this one change of metaphor changed everything about their culture and about how they treated their customers. So one of the takeaways here is that when you change the metaphor, you change the conversation. When you change the conversation, it changes behaviors. And when you change behaviors, it changes reality. So right there, this is an example of how changing the metaphor changes the reality. Last couple of things before we go to the Q&A. So one piece of advice is to start building your metaphor toolkit or toolbox, which in and of itself is a metaphor, right? When we go to Home Depot or Lowe's or any hardware store to get tools, we can either take the tools and say, what can I fix or what can I build, right? Or we can look around our house and say, what needs fixing and how can I use these tools to fix my problem? So those are two different ways to think about tools as a metaphor, right? As you add more metaphorical tools to your toolkit, you could start being more strategic. You could start being more effective and more influential in terms of connecting with and influencing your audience, your customers, your colleagues, etc. There's a saying that there's no one size fits all metaphor. Again, we need to modify it to meet the needs of our audience. But Abraham Maslow, who created the famous hierarchy of needs, one of his sayings that is very well known is that if the only tool you have is a hammer, it is tempting to treat everything as if it were a nail. So if you have one great metaphor, that's amazing and great, but you may want to add some other metaphors to your toolkit, right? Otherwise, you're just hammering away. And also, when you just keep hammering away, it gets to be a cliche. It gets to be boring. You need to think about, all right, what other metaphors can I use for different situations and different audiences that will help me to be more effective? So if you want to be a master of metaphor, 3 big takeaways to leave you with today. How many? Not 2 and not 4. Rule of 3. 3 big takeaways to leave you with. One is metaphor awareness. Start with being more attuned and aware. Notice metaphors that people are using. If one of your customers uses the same metaphor over and over again, if you start to use that metaphor or similar metaphors, again, you'll be bonding and connecting with them. They'll be thinking, all right, we're on the same page, which is a metaphor. You'll be connecting with the other person. That person will be thinking, you get me, you understand what I'm saying, I feel connected with you. So start to be more attuned to noticing the metaphors that you use and that other people use. Number 2, whether your metaphors are verbal and or visual, you can use them in combination. Sometimes it's spoken, sometimes it's an image. The image up here, an ant carrying a leaf that is like 3 or 5 times its size. You may not, I didn't mention it, you may or may not have noticed it, but subliminally, your brain notices it, right? These are 3 big takeaways. What are you taking with you? What are you carrying with you that's larger than yourself that you can use? So whether you're using spoken metaphors or visual imagery or props, you want to be more aware, more attuned, more strategic, and use some creativity and innovation in the metaphors that you use and the analogies that you use. And thirdly, be audience focused, right? In my 3-legged stool model I talk about in my book, I always start with who's my audience and what's my purpose. I know Andrea talks about that all the time, right? There's no one size fits all. You need to think about what do I want people to think, feel, know, and most importantly, do at the end of my messaging. If you are focused on your audience, if you use metaphors and analogies that resonate with them, you are going to be more effective. Because again, 1, they'll understand you, and 2, they'll feel connected with you. Okay, those are my 3 big takeaways to leave you with today. So again, for more, hope you'll check out my book, Visual Leadership. As Andrea mentioned, part 3 of my book is all about metaphors and how we could use them. And that is the magic of metaphors. So hopefully it'll help you to be more effective going forward. And I have my magic wand on my desk all the time to remind me to keep the magic going. So thank you very much. I'm going to stop sharing and turn it back to Andrea for the Q&A.
Thank you. Thank you, Todd. Big round of applause for Todd. As always, that's why I keep calling you back all the time. That's your sessions are always fantastic. And for me, the out of the three, and by the way, for everyone, if you have a question for Todd, now it's your opportunity to ask the question. Please type your question in the chat, and then I'm going to take it from there and I'm going to ask Todd. For me, Todd, out of the three key takeaways, the one that to me is the most important one, and you talked about it a lot today, is audience relevance, being audience focused. One analogy, one metaphor can help clarify your concept for someone, but the same analogy, the same metaphor could be confusing for someone else. And audience relevance, I think, is the most important principle in communication. Before we go to the questions, I have a question from my side, Todd. And the question is, now you talked about, you gave us a recommendation, and your recommendation is to,
I saw the box and then I realized
Marine, if you don't mind, if we can mute that. Your recommendation is to start building our own metaphor toolbox. So I'm curious, what have you done over the years to do that for you? How did you build your own metaphor toolbox? Any particular either daily practices or things that you do to do that?
Well, one is, when I say to people, you need to do that, it's like, it sounds daunting, but if you think about what you're already doing, you already have a starting point. We do this all the time. Hopefully today, people will just be more aware, right? You'll be hyper aware and you'll start to notice what are some metaphors that other people use? What are some metaphors that you use? What are some metaphors that are commonly used around you? What metaphors does your boss use? Your colleagues and coworkers? I recently got to be friends with someone who works for Major League Baseball. And we had lunch, and we were talking a lot using baseball metaphors, right? But I was doing a webinar for the U.S. Tennis Association. I used a lot of tennis metaphors. So speak the language of your audience, just as if you were speaking Italian and I was speaking English. If I knew some Italian words, I would use them with you, and then it's like, okay, you get me, right? So that's what I'd say. See what's already around you, and then build on that. Look through your bookshelf, right? Every book cover most likely has an image of some sort. And it's usually a metaphor, right? It's usually, and it was carefully and strategically thought through, but it's so often that we don't even notice it, or our brains don't consciously notice it, but subconsciously our brains take it in. So that's what I'd say, be more aware of the metaphors around you, and then you build from there.
Thank you, Todd. There's a question from Nicholas, and it's something you covered, but because the question is there, maybe it's worth going a little bit deeper, clarifying. The question is metaphor cultural relevant, or is it universal?
I would say, as most questions are not either or, but both. There are some that are universal, right? If we talk about the stars, right? We all see the stars. So using something like that is universal, but something that is cultural, if I use a theater analogy related to Broadway, but no one, and you're not a theater person, you may or may not get it, right? So at Columbia, I teach leadership for Broadway stage managers in their MFA theater program. In that program, I quote a lot of show tunes. I don't even need to name the show. All of a sudden, everyone's singing along. If I did the same thing in my NYU class, people would have no idea what I was talking about, right? So again, if you adapt your metaphor, your analogy to your audience, it will resonate. So I would say yes, 100%. It is cultural, but it's not just culture. It's, in terms of, different genders, different ethnicities, different, what we're familiar with. So for example, if I ask you, to ask why and say you need to be more curious, some people see Curious George and say, oh, that reminds me of my childhood. Other people say, who's that monkey, right? So again, that is cultural. I keep this on my desk to remind me to try to be more flexible. Those of us who grew up with Gumby, if I say you need to bend over backwards to serve your clients, you get it, right? You'll get it either way. That's universal. But if you know Gumby, you get extra credit points for using a metaphor that relates to your audience, right? If I talk about when I'm coaching you, what are some things you need to stop doing, start doing, and continue doing? I might hold up this, right? Not every culture uses the same color coding system or the same traffic light, but if you do, you get it immediately. If not, then I may have lost you. So again, those are just a few examples of how culture factors into the metaphors we use.
When I saw the curious monkey, I did think, who's that monkey?
Okay.
Yeah. Anyway, a question from Jason. Are there any best practices for inviting your audience to expand on a metaphor with you?
Talking about expanding, if you keep your mind closed, you're not going to get some of these metaphors. But if you expand your mind, you open up your mind, create all of this space to explore things from new perspectives. So how's that for another? Yes, Patty says, Todd has so many toys. I do. They're all around me. But I keep these things around me because physical objects are metaphors, right? One of my clients was talking about, when I worked at IBM in 1985, I just held this up. Like, you think you're impressing people, you're just sounding like a dinosaur. Your younger employees are just thinking this, you're just old, right? It's not experienced. So he remembers, I sent him a dinosaur, and now he keeps it on his desk to remind him to not sound like outdated and like an old timer, right? So that's what I'd say is, use what's around you, what's in your environment. I think I lost the thread of the question. Oh, you talk about expanding your mind. Just keeping your mind and your heart and your eyes open to things around you and say, how can I use these things? How can I weave them in? You always have your iPhone with you, right? So when you're traveling, just as I did with taking that picture of the Brooklyn Bridge as I was in that Uber going down the FDR, keep your camera open and out. Take pictures of your environment and say, how can I use this as a metaphor for something I'm doing or something I need to talk about? When you do a PowerPoint presentation, if you can incorporate your own pictures, it gives you extra power and credibility rather than just pulling an image off Google, right? So again, and it makes it more fun, and it makes you more attuned to looking for metaphors in your environment. You can go on a metaphor scavenger hunt, right? Whether you're in the city or you're out in nature, take pictures and say, how can I use this? Or what does this remind me of?
Yeah. We've got time for either one or two more questions, and I'm going in the order I see in the chart. We have a question from Ed Silva. How does business jargon play into the metaphors? How can metaphors stand out and not be dismissed as common business jargon?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that's Indrani, my friend Indrani. Yeah, I mean, so many business sayings are metaphors, but they can become cliches if they're overused or abused, right? So sometimes it's good to use a familiar metaphor because people will get it instantly. The flip side of that could backfire on you or become a cliche. So for example, the word paradigms. Joel Barker is the guru, he's a futurist who wrote a book called Paradigms. The book's outdated, but the concepts are universal and timeless. But the word paradigm has become a cliche because everyone talked about everything being a paradigm shift, right? Switching from Coke to Pepsi is not a paradigm shift, right? Switching from drinking water out of a fountain to carrying bottled water with you is a paradigm shift, right? So in my book, I have a chapter on the 10 types of thinking. So a word like paradigms, which is so powerful, if you think about what it really is about, it's about changing the lens through which you see the world. But if you just talk about, if everything's a paradigm shift, then nothing's a paradigm shift, right? So things become diluted. So that's what I'd say. If you overuse or misuse cliches and expressions, then people just like, all right, I've heard that a million times before. But if you keep things fresh, if you keep things new and innovative, then you'll communicate with greater impact. But that's a good point, is to look at business jargon and acronyms and say, all right, is this useful? Is this helping me connect, or am I losing my audience by using this language?
Let's close with this quick question, Todd, from Maruid. Yeah, I can't see the full name. Just curious, who is your favorite author?
Oh, that's a tough question. If you go to my website, go to toddcherches.com, the pop-up will be, here's a list of the top 52 books which most influenced me, my work, and my life. So that's the full list. Favorite author, I have to say, Mr. Shakespeare. I learned more from Mr. Shakespeare about management, leadership, and language and metaphor than anyone else in my life. So that's my answer to that question.
Thank you, Todd. Thank you so much again. We've got just a few minutes for me to wrap up this session. What I'll do, I'm going to share my screen quickly. I just want to make sure that you can see again our supporting partners. Check them out again. Everyday People, Alia, Impact Hub, London, Hatch, Startups Magazine, all organizations that believe in the power of business used as a force for good. As I said, we've got some free resources for you, or promotions, discounts. You've got the link in the chat. You have a QR code here if you prefer. The URL is also in on the slide. Feel free to take a screenshot or use the link in the chat. And you've got resources from our supporting partners, from Todd as well. So check it out. And also a couple of other things. One is the scorecard, and the other one is the masterclass. Now, the scorecard is, and again, you've got the links in the chat, is an online tool that allows you to very quickly assess your current presentation skills for free in less than 3 minutes. You just need to answer a few questions. You'll get a score from 0 to 100%. And the tool will tell you what that score means for you, and it will also identify opportunities for improvement. So that's one thing, check it out. The other one is our masterclass. Some of you have already attended my web class. These are Zoom sessions, very practical, less than an hour, where I go through some fundamental principles of communication that you can apply to your very next presentation. Again, check out the link. And if you find it's something that I do every other week, or when I remember, if you find a date and time that works for you, I'd love to see you there. And finally, I would be very happy to offer a presentation consultation for those, but this is not for everyone. This is only for business owners and business leaders who are motivated to take their presentation skills to a higher level, and for those who are also ready to take action to make it happen. And if you're interested, then we can have a conversation one-to-one to see if there's a fit between what you may be looking for and what we have to offer. And regardless of whether or not there's a good fit, I can promise you that if you attend the consultation, you'll walk away with much greater clarity on how you and all your colleagues, your teams, can become more confident presenters. And you'll also walk away with a free copy of my book, Confident Presenter, just for agreeing to have a chat. If you're interested, super simple, just type 121 in the chat, either in the public chat or in the private chat directly to me if you prefer, 121. And then what I'll do, I'll get in touch, I'll give you more information about the consultation. And then if together we agree that it makes sense to go ahead, then we'll go ahead and we'll find a time to speak. And this is the book that also Todd kindly mentioned, Confident Presenter. And that's it. Again, Todd, thank you so much. Thank you for your time. Thank you for sharing your insights. And for everyone, Visual Leadership, the book from Todd, highly recommended. And thanks everyone. I do hope that you enjoyed this session. I hope that you find it useful. Let's keep in touch. All the very best.
Thank you, Andrea.
Ciao.
Thank you.